Okay, chapter 5, this is civil rights as opposed to civil liberties in the previous chapter. Now, civil rights have a lot more to do with due process, that everyone's treated equally. And this has been the problem, right? We've looked at what's happened in America. We've looked at liberty. We looked at civil liberties. We've looked at property. But the one issue that we compromised on, the one issue that we compromised in the Constitution was on equality. We said different races of people were not equal to other races of people. You know, it's interesting for me, a white person growing up in a typical, American white culture. When I was a kid, I remember, they don't say this anymore. I'm a lot older than probably most of the people in the class, but when I was a kid, I remember I'd go somewhere and you'd meet somebody, and if you were a little boy, usually a little boy, not even back then, I don't think it was said to little girls very often, but you meet somebody and they look at you and they go, yeah, you could be the president someday. There was still kind of almost this awe that we lived in a country where anybody could be a president, but what they meant was any white man, pretty much. Although there was this idea of equality, there's no, it's in the Constitution. We can't grant titles of nobility. This idea of this great equality that all men are created equal, we failed miserably. As much as I think, and I've studied constitutions and I've studied, philosophy and political history and political, philosophical, political science, and I'm amazed by it, and what happened in America is phenomenal. This great experiment, a lot of people to this day, they talk about the American dream. Well, before it was known as the American dream, it was the Great American Experiment. I don't know if I talked about this in chapter 1. But in the Federalist Papers, Madison wrote that, it seems to be on the side of history for this people, talking about the Americans, to decide the important question. And this is one of those really important questions of political science. Whether men are able or not to choose for themselves good government based on reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined on their political institutions, based on accident and force. He said, history has always shown that people who rule go and they rule and they fight things. It's Machiavellian. It's go in and it's about power. Or it's mistakes or accidents that decide what happened. The American experiment was, and most people didn't believe it could happen, that the average person, the average man at the time, could decide what was best for himself. The thought was, man was not that smart. It wasn't so much about intelligence, it was about rationality. And so that was the Great American Experiment. After World War II, that kind of turned into the Great American Dream. And you hear it now, so when you think of the Great American Dream, it's the idea of, owning a home and having the white picket fence and that whole thing. That all came, the whole idea from that really kind of started from the Great American Experiment. Could man rule himself? And in doing that, the American system is phenomenal. I mean, we could spend hours talking about certain aspects of the Constitution and why Madison wrote it a certain way and how it has been phenomenal. I mean, we added things in the Constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, that most other countries to this day who have tried to copy the American system don't implement. Things that we take for granted that are part of this country, if you've been in this country for a while, you realize the separation of powers is extraordinarily important, that one branch of government does not take on more power than it should. Or checks and balances. What's going on right now with the Fast and Furious, where Congress is going to the administration and saying, hey, this really bad thing happened, we're going to hold you accountable, and you have to come to us, and if you don't answer questions, we'll hold you in contempt. And that's what's happened now. It's this would not happen in other countries. It's to this day, European countries who used a lot of what we took and built into this country still don't have separation of powers like that. Still don't have checks and balances. Most other countries of the world don't. So it is phenomenal. But at the same time, to do all these amazing things, to stand so far opposed to true equality is pretty amazing. So of those issues, liberty we did pretty good. Property we did pretty good. Equality, not real well. So this came back to cause extraordinarily powerful problems. So, we allowed slavery. We allowed slave importation, which continued until, Civil War. All these horrible things, all these compromises that we made to make sure the southern states were still part of the Union, caused problems. And up until, so now we have the Civil War, and we say, in the Constitution, we add these amendments saying, no, you can't treat people differently based on their race, according to the law. There's due process, and there should be fairness for all that. But even that doesn't stop it. We end up with Jim Crow laws, and laws that say segregation is okay, separate but equal. So it actually, and I think in the discussion board for chapter 5 for this chapter, I ask you, why do you think it took 80 years from the 14th Amendment till we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Or that 100 years, whatever that was, 80 years, 100 years, 120 years, what a long time, before there was actual the Congress actually went and made law making sure that this would be the case. And that's where civil rights come into play. And that's why you hear of them so much today. Because as a country, we pretty much failed when it came to equality. Because equality meant white men. It didn't mean people of different races. And it didn't mean women. Remember, women wouldn't get to vote till 1925. So we had this problem with equality. And so that's why today's civil rights are so extraordinarily important. That we make sure that we treat all people fairly and according to the same rules. And this is really important to put this all together. And it kind of comes back to what we did in that first chapter. What's more important, liberty, equality, or property? And I think we're hopefully seeing that they all play together. And if you take away part of one, you really cause problems with the other ones. And you can't truly have liberty without equality. So, and we'll talk about property. I think other people would argue about that. Some people think it's really important, some people don't. And we'll talk about that, have discussions about that. But, I'm going on too long. That's civil rights. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you in the next chapter.